Good afternoon, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be here with you today at this important plenary session on Canadian investment in research for development in Asia. My name is Julia Scott, and I serve as the Vice President of Member Services at Universities Canada, and I am delighted to moderate this session, which brings together a distinguished group of experts to explore Canada's long-standing role in fostering research and innovation partnerships across Asia. So we are meeting at a very critical time when global challenges, climate change, geopolitical shifts, public health crises, and digital transformation are testing the resilience of societies and economies. And more than ever, high-quality, evidence-based research is essential to inform policies, drive innovation, and create sustainable solutions. For decades, Canada has been a reliable partner in advancing research for development in the Global South, particularly in Asia. Our institutions, researchers, and funding bodies have worked alongside regional counterparts to address pressing issues such as poverty, inequality, governance, and environmental sustainability. One of the most impactful vehicles for this engagement has been the International Development Research Center, IDRC, which has supported research and innovation in developing countries for over 5 decades. Since 2016 alone, IDRC has invested over 500 million Canadian dollars into research initiatives across Asia and the Pacific, helping to build local research capacity and generate evidence-based solutions for complex regional challenges. But as all of you know, Canada's contributions go well beyond financial investments. Our research institutions foster long-term collaborations, knowledge exchange, and innovation ecosystems that empower communities and drive lasting change. Universities, think tanks, and civil society organizations are key players in these efforts, ensuring that research not only generates new knowledge, but also translates into meaningful policy interventions and on-the-ground impact. The research for development agenda in Asia has evolved significantly over the years, from early projects focused on poverty reduction and health interventions to contemporary initiatives tackling artificial intelligence, cyber governance, and climate resilience. The landscape of collaboration continues to expand. However, as our panelists will discuss today, research partnerships in Asia face new and emerging challenges. Geopolitical shifts and national policy changes have in some cases constrained the space for independent research. Funding landscapes are changing, requiring institutions to adapt and find new models to sustain research efforts. And there's an increasing need to integrate interdisciplinary approaches that connect science, technology, policy, and social sciences to develop more holistic solutions to development challenges. So our discussion today will shed some light onto these dynamics and explore how Canada can continue to play a pivotal role in strengthening research partnerships in Asia for mutual benefit. So to help unpack some of these themes, we have an outstanding panel of experts who bring diverse perspectives and deep experience in research in development. So please allow me to introduce them. We have Dr. Kapil Kapoor, Asia Regional Director, IDRC. Dr. Kapoor has extensive experience in shaping IDRC's global research agenda in Asia and working with institutions across the region to drive impactful research outcomes. Professor Jean-Louis Arcand, President, Global Development Network. As leading economist and development researcher, he has played a central role in advancing research for development collaborations globally. Professor Wong, Vice President, International, University of Toronto. A scholar of political science and public policy at the Munk School of Global Affairs. Professor Wong has led numerous international research initiatives, particularly in Asia and Africa, focusing on governance, democracy, and social innovation. And Ms. Helani Galpaya, Chief Executive Officer, LIRNEAsia, a leading expert in digital policy and technology governance. Ms. Galpaya has worked extensively on research projects related to digital policy reforms across the region. So without further ado, we will dive into 2 rounds of questions. In the first round, we will explore the relevance and effectiveness of research for development in Asia, looking at past achievements and the role of Canadian investment in advancing knowledge-related solutions. And in the second round, we'll turn to some of the challenges facing research collaborations today, from funding constraints to the evolving geopolitical landscape, and how institutions can navigate these complexities while maintaining integrity and impact. And then finally, should time permit, we will pass to the floor for questions, for audience questions, and we'll encourage all of you to take the opportunity to engage with our panelists and share your own perspectives. So with that, we'll dive into the discussion. My first question is for Professor Jean-Louis. Can you talk about the relevance of research for development for the Global South from your perspective? Has it been effective in solving regional challenges such as poverty, inequality, and climate change? Over to you, Jean-Louis.
Merci beaucoup. So I lead the international organization which is devoted to capacity building for researchers in social science in the Global South, including Asia, obviously, but we sort of have a global remit. We were created by Joe Stiglitz back in 1999. I think I know a little bit about research. I'm a recovering academic. That's the way I like to term myself. I've been an academic at various institutions, most recently 15 years in Switzerland. And as a development economist, and I put my development economist hat on here, the problem with research in the Global South, as everywhere else, but it's particularly salient in the Global South, is that research is a public good. And by public good, I mean it in the economic sense. So let me just remind you about Econ 101. So Econ 101 tells us that a public good is a good which is non-rival and it's non-exclusive, right? And given that it's non-rival, which means that my consumption of the output of that research doesn't affect your consumption, right? Just because I produce a paper and you read it doesn't stop someone else from reading the paper. And it's non-exclusive, you can't stop people from reading the paper. What Basic Economics 101 tells you is that this will be underprovided by the market. And therefore, even a Chicago economist, to the right of Attila the Hun, would essentially tell you that you need non-market solutions to get enough of that good and service, namely research. So, I mean, that's a truism, it's obvious, but it is particularly true in the Global South and in Asia, because the marginal product also of that research is extremely high. We'll come back to that, I think, in the second round of questions. Now, in some sense, what's important here, I think, and I've contributed to the problem, we need to sort of go beyond the consultant mode in some sense. Because in the Global South, in Asia also, I see it all over the world, the response of a lot of governments in terms of solving issues which can be solved by research is to go and find a consultant. And when I was an academic, I did this all the time. I was called in, and you have the sort of the consultant crowd, you have the Cambridge Mass crowd, you've got the London crowd, you've got the Paris School of Economics crowd. It's a standard crowd. You come in, they cut you a check, you do the research, and then that's it. Now this doesn't work. I mean, it works, but it creates no local capacity. And so what is key for the future of research in the Global South, and if we actually want to make it work, is that we create that local capacity. And that's something that both GDN and also with the support of IDRC has been trying to do. Manifestly, so far, this has been a total failure. And the reason I'll say it's a total failure is because we're still needed. If we'd been successful, there would be no need for what we're doing. And there still is huge need, and the marginal product of supporting that kind of work is enormous.
Thank you so much, Jean-Louis. The next question is for Dr. Kapil Kapoor. So Kapil, can you give us a brief snapshot on how IDRC has supported research for development in Asia, and what are some of its key achievements in addressing sustainable development challenges in the region?
Thanks very much, Julie. Let me just start by taking up the point, Jean-Louis, that you made just now, which is how important it is to build local capacity for research. Because that's the only way in which research will actually translate into policy at the local level. And we at IDRC firmly believe that it's by twinning local research with researchers in the north and by building capacity at a local level that you can really come up with local solutions. Why is that? Because local researchers understand the situation on the ground, they understand local cultural nuances, they understand the political economy of reform. So if research is to actually translate into policy action, it is critically important to have local researchers. And that's what IDRC has been doing. For those of you who don't know the International Development Research Center, we were founded by a Canadian Act of Parliament in 1970. So we've been around for over 5 decades. And in Asia, for example, since over the last decade, we have spent about $500 million Canadian in over 500 projects, working across 32 countries in Asia. With those resources, we have built local capacity, we have advocated for solutions to climate change, we have supported better health systems, we have supported better education systems, we have helped contribute to improved governance. And I can give you a few examples, which I will in a moment, but I think it's important to understand that we also don't work by ourselves. Yes, the Canadian Parliament gives us some resources, but we like to leverage that money. So since 2020, we have mobilized over $400 million from bilateral partners like the UK and Norway and Denmark and Sweden, and foundations like the Ford Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to supplement our resources so that we can increase the pile of money that is available for Southern-led research. Let me give you a few, when you talk about research, it's pretty abstract. So I can give you a few examples, but the time doesn't permit me to go into more, so let me just put in a plug. We have a side session today at about 3:15. I think it's VIP room B, where we'll talk a bit more about the work of IDRC and give you many more examples. So those of you who are interested, please join us there. But so let me give you one or two sort of very concrete examples of our impact. In the area of food production and food security, we financed a project where we brought in researchers from India and researchers from Canada who worked together on a natural plant extract called hexanol. And what this plant extract does, it increases the shelf life of soft fruit like bananas, papayas, mangoes. And they developed an application which farmers have started using, and already we've seen 25,000 farmers across Asia increase their incomes by 20% because the shelf life of their produce is now expanded. Over the next few years, this will grow into 150,000 farmers across Asia and then more, as just one example, right? Let me give you another example from the health sector. Turns out that Thailand has a very high incidence of liver cancer. And among many reasons for this, one reason is a particular parasite that exists in fish that is consumed by the local population. So what IDRC did was, over a 6-year period, we financed, I think it was 20 multidimensional teams to look into this issue. And once again, they have come up with applications which have now reduced the incidence of this parasite from 70% in the fish species to less than 1%. The incidence of liver cancer in Thailand has come down from 50% by 50% over the last 6 years, 7 years. So just another example of the kind of research that IDRC funds, which has very, very practical implications. We've also developed a particular expertise in working in countries that are going through a difficult political situation. And our work in Myanmar, which has been going on for the last decade, is a good example of that. What we like to do is we like to support researchers who are now living in diaspora countries like India, in Thailand, in Canada. And we finance about 120 scholars who are researching different aspects of life in Myanmar in the hope that once normalcy comes around in Myanmar, there is this critical mass of people available to help provide policy support to the new government. So let me just conclude by saying, Asia is very complex. The countries are very different. We have programs in 32 countries right now. But I think given the resources that have been provided to us, what we've been particularly successful in doing is creating this immense network of over 200 think tanks, civil society organizations, NGOs, who have just created this virtual network and are now contributing to sustained policy reform across the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Kapil, for those terrific examples and also for picking up on the theme of capacity building for research and that theme of translating research to action, which I think is a great segue to my next question for Helani. Since LIRNEAsia has been a longtime partner of IDRC, can you reflect on your experience with the types of partnerships and research that IDRC has supported and its impact in the region?
Yeah, thanks, Julia. I think for us as a fundee, when I look back, I see 4 thematics in the kind of work IDRC funded, and they translate into the kind of impact the funding had. The first one, I think, is ecosystem, as JL and Kapil talked about. It's not just an investment in doing the research, it is also building the ecosystem. So when Myanmar opened up in 2012 for foreign investment, we were there the day the new licenses for telecom companies were given out. With World Bank money, we were funded. Immediately afterwards, IDRC asked us to go into Myanmar. And we found the local partners and we started working. And we were the first when companies there or civil society did not have registered bank accounts. We would carry money and go into Myanmar because we couldn't transfer money. But the funding, the ecosystem approach was not just the research, is to recognize that you need a strong civil society to hold government to account when it comes to digital policy. You need media who can recognize what good research is. So you need parliamentarians trained on what good policy making is and why public consultation is important. So we did all of this kind of capacity building, not just carrying out the research. The second is early. I mean, 2012 in Myanmar, and IDRC's talked to us by 2013. That's really early. The kind of risk and financial de-risking that required, working, transferring money, blacklisted banks, and so on, right? But what that did is by the time we did Myanmar's first nationally representative survey on digital access and use, we realized the digital story in Myanmar is completely different to everywhere else. People are all online, not on voice. So therefore, when the government is taxing the private companies, you don't need to reinvest that money into digital rollout and giving them smartphones. You can actually use that money for really marginalized people with disabilities to get onto the digital economy. So the Universal Service Fund gets fundamentally redesigned, completely different to the trajectory of Asia. Third is comparative. So funding 3 organizations and doing multiple contracts across Africa, Asia, and Latin America to enable us to study digital development shows, for example, all this digital stuff, they have indicators, follow GDP per capita, right? The richer countries do better in connecting people, lower gender gaps, and so on. But suddenly, we realized in 2018, India's gender gap is as bad or worse than much poorer African countries. And insight that never comes unless you do really comparable research with 3 organizations, similar methods. And IDRC funds that and goes through the effort. And that enables us to influence the Department of Telecom to sort of focus on gender and gender connectivity. And the final one is context sensitive. It can be time or the development context and the quick pivot. So in 2021-22, when everyone else was sort of just about recovering from COVID, Sri Lanka went head-on into a huge fiscal crisis, unable to service our foreign debt. The country is right now under IMF bailout, early stages. But at that point, 30-hour fuel queues and 14-hour power cuts, social welfare and social safety net payments were absolutely vital to make sure a lot of our citizens didn't die. We were in the middle of designing research to understand whether COVID was impacted by digital connectivity. And then we realized, my God, we need to support the social welfare scheme. So we talked to IDRC, added additional modules to this research, and by the time the data came out, we were the only rigorous research on real poverty levels in the country. That leads us to then be invited into the room to redesign and write the policy on social welfare and follow on work to see whether that's actually being implemented and why it's working and why it's not. So these four aspects really lead to sort of tangible, different types of impact, and it's because of the flexibility, it's because of the early entrance, seeing the changes early, it's about thinking about the ecosystem and so on.
Great, thank you so much, Helani. My next question is for Joe. So over the past decade, IDRC has supported the University of Toronto to generate research on various areas, from health and pandemic preparedness to addressing cyber governance and strengthening democracy and next generation of leaders in Myanmar. Can you reflect on the research that IDRC has supported at the Munk School of Global Affairs and the role it has played in shaping evidence-based policies for sustainable development in the region and the SDGs more broadly?
Sure. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. It was really cold here earlier this morning. I fear I may have lost my voice then. Thank you very much for the question. Let me begin by saying, first, I'm really pleased that the verb that we're using for this panel is the verb investing. And I think it's critical that we continue to do that. So often, research and work that's being done in the Global South is not necessarily seen as investment, but seen in other forms, in part because it's to support potentially market-failing research and so forth. But the power of that word, I think, is really critical. If you look just south of our border in Canada right now, we have a president, Donald Trump, who says the most outrageous things, but nonetheless has a good portion of Americans believing that things like a trade imbalance is a subsidy and that investments in the Global South is philanthropy. What we're really talking about is investing in the capacity of a significant part of the world that will ultimately benefit those of us in Canada as well. So in terms of the research that the IDRC has generously invested in at the University of Toronto, includes things like investments in democracy building and strengthening in the context of Myanmar, for instance. How do we put into place the institutions to ensure that as this transitioning country and polity emerges from the current autocratic or current political instability, such that it becomes a stable democracy, an important partner with which we can be trading, an important partner with which we can be further collaborating. Investments that have been made, for instance, more recently in some of the work that we're doing in the Munk School now on entrepreneurship, particularly in Global South settings. We know that so much of late or so-called late development is going to be driven by entrepreneurship. We hear this all the time. In the work that we're doing, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, the entire hopes of that continent is pinned on the productive energy of entrepreneurship and startups. In many ways, though, this is really greenfield. We don't really know what the impact, particularly in low and middle income countries, the impact of entrepreneurial startups on labor market absorption. We don't know if it's going to generate the kinds of jobs that's going to create the kind of productivity and stability that we're seeking. So doing that kind of research, again, is an investment in potential trading partners and potential collaborators, both at the university and also the economy. My own work, which is around the question of reaching the hardest to reach, we've really inverted the question in terms of how do we deliver interventions by looking at how we deliver interventions in the margins and on the periphery. Now, this is an important question because in many ways, when we think about traditional scaling of successful models, they ultimately become market-failing endeavors because the marginal cost of reaching the hardest to reach is simply cost prohibitive. But what if we start thinking about how do we reach those in the margins and scaling in the margins? This is, again, an entirely new field of research that is going to be most critically felt in the Global South, but indeed harbors lessons for us in Canada as well, as we think about some of the most underserved communities and populations in our own country, and we grapple with questions on how we reach the hardest to reach. Why all of this is important in terms of the SDGs, and I really think this is critical. Unfortunately, in the current context of all of this geopolitical turmoil, the Sustainable Development Goals, I fear, have somewhat receded in terms of prominence. The fact of the matter is we're going to fail to reach most of the SDGs. We're about to gear up to start talking about what the post-2030 agenda is going to look like. And I think it's absolutely critical that universities have a seat at that table. We didn't have a seat at the table in the development of the SDGs, which always struck me as somewhat strange, given that so many of the innovations that are actually being implemented are being innovated in the universities. So many of the leaders who are going to lead the SDG agenda and eventually the post-2030 agenda are in our classrooms now. It's as though we had set up a set of targets and goals with absolutely no idea or theories on how we were going to arrive there. In cartographical terms, it's like we had a destination but no map to take us there. The kind of work that IDRC has supported in universities is precisely the kind of intelligence that needs to be at that table, not as a supporting actor, but really at that table in charting out the post-2030 agenda. So again, as I think about the investments now, they're going to have a short-term impact, a positive impact in all the ways that my colleagues have described. But it's an investment in ensuring that the kind of work that's being done in civil society, and NGOs, think tanks, and universities get us a seat at that table when we start talking about the post-2030 agenda. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. I'd like to move into the second round of questions for our panelists, which are going to be focused more on the challenges facing research and research collaborations today. So my first question is for Jean-Louis. Given the evolving nature of geopolitics and national political landscapes, we've witnessed a shrinking space for independent research. So if you could reflect on this and share how national and regional research councils and think tanks and universities should position themselves as they go about conducting research to address policy priorities in the region through high-quality research.
Okay. So, as I said earlier, I'm a recovering academic. So, when I was an academic, including my first job, which was actually at the Université de Montréal, during those 30 years, I've been the supervisor for 71 PhD dissertations. Now, that's a heck of a lot of PhD dissertations. Most of those people were from the Global South. Perfect quality as in terms of research capacity, in terms of producing scientific articles, but what we don't teach them in universities are soft skills, are the communication skills, are how you get that research to policymakers. That we don't teach. That we're very bad at. Now, I tried to compensate for that simply because I'm a development economist. I was dealing with the World Bank, with the fund, with various, regional, MDBs. So I think I inculcated the capacity to transmit this in terms of, to my kids, to my 71 kids. But this is something that universities, think tanks, regional consortia, that's something where we have to be able to take things to scale. And that's something that is desperately lacking because as researchers in the Global North, we're really bad at that. That's the first point. The second point that I'd like to make, and in some sense it sort of harps to a buzzword in terms of like finance shortfall in the world, we have to start thinking in terms of blended research finance. Okay, I don't want to introduce another acronym into the world. There are already enough of them. When he took over as the new president of the World Bank, he said that he was going to create a vice presidency at the World Bank for acronyms because they have so many of them at the World Bank. But let me put it this way. One of the things also that the academic world is really bad at doing is engaging with the private sector. We're really bad at that. There's sort of a vade retro satanas, with respect to the private sector when you're in the academic world. And we need to find a way to engage better with the private sector. We need blended research funding, just as we have blended finance for infrastructure, right? And the whole point here is that, the space is getting smaller, right? And it's not just south of the Canadian border. It's getting smaller everywhere, okay? Everybody, all of the G7 countries are cutting back on their international assistance. Now, the French are cutting back like by 25%. I mean, I spent a lot of time in France, and we have major funding from the French government. And public support by bilaterals and multilaterals for research should be seen as a catalyst. And it should be seen as a catalyst which will unlock the private sector. Not just through CSR, including CSR. This is very hard to do because we're not used, as researchers, we're not used to talking to the private sector. So this is something that we really have to work on. If we don't work on this, we're going to be as dead as the dodo, and we're not going to be able to accomplish our mission. The problem here, as with many things, is the devil is in the details, and the devil is going to be essentially in terms of the mechanisms for doing so. And I would urge everyone in this room to try to think about what the appropriate mechanisms for blending research funding should be.
Great, thank you, Jean-Louis, and great comments on that scalability piece, as well as your call to action to engage with the private sector. Kapil, considering what Jean-Louis has just shared, what's IDRC's perspective on these developments in the region, and how do you see IDRC addressing these challenges going forward? And if you could comment on some of the key research priorities in the region as well.
Yeah, thanks very much. I fully agree with this point of blended finance for research. I mean, there's so much of dependence on sort of tax dollars to fund research. And research is an easy target to cut. So, but I do want to go back to this whole issue of the global climate in which research finds itself. It's really a challenging time for all of us, particularly for the research community, because there is a growing level of suspicion among governments, not just in terms of suspicion on multilateralism, but also suspicion about aid, right? Who's providing the aid? Where is it coming from? Is there a hidden agenda? We've done some studies recently in partnership with GDN, and researchers are telling us that they feel increasingly threatened. The space for independent research is shrinking. They tell us that they feel the need to self-censor themselves in case they're targeted. We find that there is a plethora of regulations which is inhibiting research, particularly regulations surrounding the use of foreign exchange. Researchers are finding it increasingly difficult to receive foreign financing. And the other phenomenon that we are seeing is that governments are increasingly partnering with think tanks who they consider like-minded, and are increasingly marginalizing those think tanks, universities, where they feel that the results of research might embarrass government or might raise difficult questions. So that's the sort of climate, the research environment within which we are operating, not in all the countries, but in a large percentage, a large proportion of the countries where we are active. So what is it that we are doing? So we continue to believe very strongly that now more than ever before, there's a real need for independent research, evidence-based research, research that can inform policy, right? We firmly believe that. But at the same time, we feel that it is increasingly important for think tanks, universities, civil society groups to better understand the priorities of government, to learn to speak and communicate in the same language, to see if the research for development landscape can find common areas for collaboration. I think now more than ever before, we feel that partnerships are much more important than they have ever been. And so we are trying very, very hard to build these partnerships, not just between organizations, think tanks, and universities, but with the private sector, with regional organizations, with international organizations. Because if a research entity feels threatened doing research independently, maybe a solution is to work as a collective, to partner with regional organizations, to partner with multilateral organizations. And maybe that way they will not feel threatened. We also feel that, in terms of priorities, regional cooperation and regional collaboration through organizations like ASEAN and so forth are very, very important. And that's why we had an intensive one-day engagement with ASEAN last December, where we got in sort of researchers from all the ASEAN countries to work with the ASEAN Secretariat to say, what is the future of research? How can an organization like IDRC support you in your priorities? And I think we need to do much more than that. In terms of research priorities for the future, increasingly governments are coming to us with solutions related to climate. It's a huge area, and what we would like to do is to focus on a small subset. And what IDRC is doing is focusing on food systems and trying to support research in sustainable food systems, particularly farmers, female farmers, who are very dependent upon the agricultural sector. Following the pandemic, governments are very concerned about the health sector. So they're coming to us repeatedly to say, how do we insulate the health sector from future epidemics, from future pandemics? And so we are supporting a lot of research around that. We also are doing a lot of research in how to help voices that might not have support, the vulnerable, the poor, who need to exercise their democratic rights to access services. There's a lot of push for EdTech. How do we get the quality of education up so that the population, the workforce of the future, is ready for the jobs of the future? A lot of pressure on us to deliver on artificial intelligence. How do you make sure that artificial intelligence will help contribute to increasing productivity rather than replacing labor force? So we're launching a brand new program for AI for development in Asia related to that. And finally, a lot of pressure from countries to really work on creating economies that are sustainable, where people will have opportunities for jobs going forward. A lot of concern about youth unemployment in particular. So all of these areas are very ripe for future research, and we're always looking for partnership in these areas.
Thank you, Kapil. And again, a great segue to my next question for Helani. As an Asia-based grantee working with IDRC and with other institutions, what are your perspectives on these dynamic shifts in the research for development landscape across the region, and how do you see the research agenda reflecting this?
Look, we call ourselves a pro-poor, pro-market think tank. So working with private sector is sort of home territory. This is not at all new. You know, when we did our first surveys of how poor people use or don't use digital technologies, the first event we had was for CEOs of telecom companies, because we saw the addressable market is not the $100 a month spending person, but it was the $10 a month at the moment. And they were like, well, we can't make money. And we said, no, you can. And now, you know, companies are making money at $2 a month, right? So, and it's not just financing, I think it's also in kind. So for example, in the countries in South Asia where there's no sophisticated Internet of Things and sensors on buses, 90+% of people walking around with their cell phones is the best signal of many things, right? Of people movement. What happens when you build a new highway? What happens to labor movement, the labor market? Where do people live and work? Where are the people, economic, commercial versus residential areas when you combine these data streams? So in-kind contribution, like 6 trillion call detail records from private telecom companies, anonymized, 3 months old, so privacy is taken care of, is what's helping us do that research. So it's not just the financing. I think there's a lot of engagement with private sector that you can do. I agree with Kapil. I think as a fundee, the huge things that really impact, I think, the people's lives, and therefore a huge part of our focus is climate change and AI, right? For example, we see that reflected already in some of IDRC's sort of calls. The women, and there are certain groups who are going to be hugely impacted by climate change. We know automation of jobs, but we don't know which jobs are going away and which tasks are going away. But we know that what we will lose is probably going to be quite different to what the OECD countries lost and are losing in terms of jobs. So IDRC put out a call for, I think it was called the Future Works Initiative, really to design the kind of skills and labor markets that will ensure that Asia's workers are ready in the face of demographic shifts, climate change, and AI. So that's a real example that we see now being implemented. The other one is really about AI and governance. I mean, AI, as much as every country in the region is really, really interested in signaling that we are open for business for AI, right? They want the investment. They see it as a way of leapfrogging and catching up on many things in the development trajectory. But AI is also a huge sort of absorption of energy in countries that are not even fully electrified, right? So I don't think there's enough thinking going into what kind of industrial policy on data centers and compute power that is required, right? And also, how do we ensure, as Kapil said, the responsible governance of AI, but not giving up on the innovative and economic development, the growth narrative of AI? So I know there's sort of future calls that are coming up. So on the fundee side, we see sort of the long-term problems that we see increasingly reflected in the kind of calls for proposals that IDRC is putting out.
Wonderful, thanks, Helani. Shifting over to Joe, can you share a Canadian perspective on some of these regional developments that we've been talking about, and thinking about how Canadian universities and research institutions can do better at positioning themselves to strengthen collaborations and partnerships in Asia to effectively address these priorities?
Sure. So I have two things that I want to say in response to that. The first is recently we had the pollster who works for the AAU, the Association of American Universities, up. And he was sharing with us some of the polling data that he had compiled over the last 2 years. It was really interesting because when Americans are asked whether they have a positive impression of elite universities, the percentage of Americans who have a positive impression of elite universities is very low, consistently polls at around 30%, which is not a good sign for the sector in terms of the confidence that, at least in the United States, that citizens have in universities. On one day, they changed the survey question, and they changed it from, or at least this pollster changed it in terms of, changed the term from America's elite universities to America's leading research universities, and ran the poll the same day that the first poll was ran, so you could control for all of the variables. And those with a positive impression of America's leading research universities was 70%. So just the change in how you frame what it is that universities do fundamentally changes how people perceive the impact that universities can have. Now, I tell you that because I think this actually positions us well when we think about how universities can collaborate more closely with the private sector. In fact, this was one of the points I wanted to raise in Stephen Toop's earlier panel was, this is actually an important way in which business can collaborate with universities in the area of research. It is seen as both desirable, and it's also seen as a source of market competitiveness. If we take the idea of investing in research in the Global South, I think we can, again, fundamentally change the way in which we approach the kind of work that has been discussed here. That these are investments in research that's going to create, ultimately, competitive advantages in the marketplace. So that's the first thing, I think. I think there's a real opportunity for universities to recast and reposition how they are viewed by society more generally, by investors within society, and the market. The second, and this is a very concrete proposal in terms of one of the areas in which I think universities specifically, and here I'm speaking in my capacity as the VP International at U of T. There's a real opportunity for universities in Canada to work with the higher ed sector in the Global South in terms of institutional strengthening of their universities. Because after all, we talk about the increased collaboration between scholars in the Global North, or researchers in the Global North and in the Global South, but so much of that will ultimately hinge on the sustainability and the institutional resilience of these universities. We see in war-torn countries like Myanmar, where universities have completely collapsed. And so the research foundation and firmament is completely gone. I have the privilege of sitting on the board of a very prominent African university. And as one of the privileges of being on their board is I get a look, quote unquote, under the hood. This is an extraordinary university. But in terms of the institutional capacity of what this university can do, it lacks a lot of institutional strength. And it has asked the University of Toronto to work with them in terms of capacity building. Things like research management, things like their IP office, their tech transfer office, things like governance, things like finance, fundraising, alumni relations, and so forth. All of these are the institutional ingredients that create the kind of resilience that we need in universities. If there are ways in which Canadian universities can be working with, in partnership, co-creating efforts and institutional strengthening and capacity building in the higher ed sector, that sets us up with partners in the Global South that we can be collaborating with, working with, and co-creating with for the longer term. So that's a very concrete way in which I think universities can very quickly be contributing to the work that's being done in the Global South. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Joe. We are pretty close to being at time, and I know you're probably anxious to stretch your legs and get some coffee, but perhaps we can take one question from the audience and do a quick tour, and perhaps our panelists can make themselves available at the break for any further questions. Is there somebody who has a burning question for our panel? Seeing no. There's a microphone that'll come.
Hi, I'm Gabby Serafini, and I'm from Vancouver, Canada, and I've worked in global health since the early 1990s. So I was a Canadian Crossroads kid that went over to Africa, became very inspired by living there, and have carried on working there. This panel has been incredibly interesting and meaningful to me, and there have been a number of things said that I sort of want to push back a little bit against and challenge you. So Jean-Louis, earlier you mentioned that you thought, that we're still needed in these countries and therefore we haven't been successful. But I would actually say that I hope we always need each other, because I think that working in collaboration and partnership between Global South and Global North inspires us as a society to care more about what's going on. So I would love to hear more about that. We're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals and sustainability. So one thing that I have found in working in global health is that the pillars of focus change about every 4 years in terms of these are the new priorities. And maybe those priorities did come from the country, but I can tell you that we came from, my company represents an innovation that was developed in Kenya in the early 2000s. Our founder then helped contribute to the guidelines for the WHO, and what it actually takes to scale an innovation, if we want to go in there and start funding innovators, the reality of taking that to scale, what I fear is that pilotitis, with all the research that happens, that now we're going to have like entrepreneurship-itis or startup-itis as well. And we followed all the rules along the way, but when those parameters keep changing, all of a sudden, we're working towards this goal of building something sustainable and meaningful that is improving outcomes, but you no longer qualify after so many years. So how do you propose, solving that problem? And AI is a whole nother story because, and any of you work in Africa, they're resistant to going to the cloud. So data residency is absolutely critical. You can't run AI off that. So I know I'm kind of going on and on, but because this is a very complex thing you're trying to do, and so I would just like you to maybe answer some of those questions.
Wonderful. Thank you for your question. I know it might be difficult, but perhaps a quick 30 seconds per panelist. Some final reflections.
Point taken. Let me just tell a story. So, PhD student of mine, very good. Actually, I'll give you, you talk Africa, I'll respond Africa. Sorry that we're at, CIAC, but let me just, okay. Senegalese kid, okay? Trained him, great PhD, went back to Senegal. Now, so impact evaluation specialist. We did stuff actually on malaria. I do stuff on malaria, schisto, stuff like that. So I see where you're coming from. This guy now in Senegal, if there's a call for proposals for any impact evaluation, he wins it. He doesn't need my help. Okay? For me, that's success, right? If we work together, it's because we enjoy working together, and it's sort of a collaboration between like-minded people. What I'm saying in terms of our collective failure is that there is still the need for grassroots support, and that's where I say that I wish we were useless.
Excellent. Kapil.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to go back to the first point. I mean, I think I emphasized, I continue to believe, and we continue to believe, that these partnerships are very important. And it's not in the sense of the North telling the South what to do, but there's a virtuous circle where a group of researchers can learn from each other and just come up with solutions that are context-specific, so that, because knowledge in the abstract can be applied very differently depending upon the individual country circumstances. To address your point about constantly changing priorities, I mean, I think that's why I think I made the point that it's very, very important to understand the local situation. Who's changing the context? Why is the context being changed? If you were partnering with policymakers in trying to come up with a joint solution to a particular problem, hopefully they would not keep shifting the goalposts on you, that the goalposts would remain constant. What I often find is that sometimes there is a mismatch. Policymakers are looking at, you said the health sector, a particular issue from one lens. Researchers are looking at it from a completely different lens. And often the two trains don't meet. And I've been encouraging our teams to work very, very closely with policymakers right from the very beginning, so that there is conformity in terms of that's the objective, that's where we want our research to take us. These are the results, through which we'll measure success or failure, in the hope that while we are going there, these goalposts don't shift. At least that's the hope.
Helani.
Yeah, nowhere is sort of global geopolitical polarization more visible than when it comes to digital governance, right? I mean, every country that in South Asia is stuck between the American capital private sector driven model, the Chinese government-centric, and EU sort of rights-based, slightly more citizen-centric model, right? And these come to our countries along with funding as well. So we're really stuck in there. So when we talk to governments, while we really want responsible, accountable AI, for example, I talk economics with them. I talk jobs. I talk all these other things, and then say, by the way, why don't you also in the drafting have a sub of the national AI policy in country X, have an accountability subcommittee and get a bunch of people, and that's how I go in. I also use quantification. When Pakistan wants to localize all its data, we actually do the numbers on, if you localize and run data centers, here's the cost, here's the lost opportunity cost. Now you can have a localization strategy, but your investment, foreign investment into data centers has to cross this threshold in the next 5 years, we actually did this, in order to justify the loss of business and the extra cost your SMEs are gonna face. So I use sort of these other tools. I mean, certainly we don't come at this with a traditional, always leading with human rights, because that's really problematic language for many governments in my region.
Yeah, I share with you the concern around the various itises that you've just described, and I see that really as a function, again, of an agenda that was set up in which there are goals, but without any sense of evidence-based theories on how we're actually going to achieve them. And so again, as we think about the post-2030 agenda, this is where I think we need, I mean, the SDGs and so forth were always in the UN framework and intergovernmental agreement. The corporates got involved through the Global Compact. Universities and researchers need to be at that table as well in order to inform what it is that what it is it's going to take with an evidence-based research agenda to get from point A to point B. I think that was one of the gravest mistakes in the 2015 agenda, and that we really have to think with a little bit more foresight moving forward. Thank you.
Great. So I think it's quite clear that Canada's investment in research and development in Asia has not only facilitated innovation but fostered long-term partnerships, but there's still a lot to be done. There's a shifting and dynamic research agenda and priorities, a necessity to consider how partnerships are done and how we work with the private sector, and A lot of the comments on capacity building and how we grapple with the push and pull of how we work with one another are still sort of challenges yet to be completely sort of solved. So I want to thank the panelists that have joined me here today, Professor Jean-Louis Arcand, Dr. Kapil Kapoor, Ms. Helani Galpaya, and Professor Joe Wong for your insights. And thank you very much for your time and sharing your expertise with us today. Thank you.